So, welcome back. Our next presenter is Dr. Robert Schoch, an absolutely brilliant academic who is bringing cutting-edge information. And so, an Earthkeeper round of applause for my very good friend, Dr. Robert Schoch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think I'm using this one. Is this one working now? Okay. He's going to, now is it working? Yes, and it really is, as I said yesterday, a pleasure to be here. And I want to just say again, we've said this before, but to James and Ann, because they make this all possible. Let's have a quick round of applause for them, because it's really important that, we're all being brought here together. So I'm going to jump into this because we have, we're running a little bit late, but that's okay. And also, hopefully everything will work with the computer. For a second here, my computer was technology, I don't know, it was really... the gremlins, yeah, the things that are in it. So anyway, I want to talk about Easter Island today. I'm going to revisit a couple of themes that we talked about yesterday, but go into more detail on them, and then conclude with some new things. And I also want to mention that, unfortunately, and this is no offense to anyone, I would love to stay all night and into tomorrow, but I have obligations because I am an academic. Remember, we talked about that, and I actually have some obligations at Boston University, so I have to get back. So Katie and I are leaving, 2:30ish or something like that. So please, So please, I hope I don't want to sound the wrong way, but right after I finish speaking, go grab a copy of my book, and I'm happy to sign it for you. No, I'm serious, because otherwise you're going to miss your chance. I've had so many times people say to me later, I thought you were going to be around all night, and no. Also, if you don't buy them, then I might have to carry some of them back. So buy copies for your friends and everything. No, but what I mean seriously is that we do have to leave to catch a flight. This is, I guess, modern society. I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to have to get there physically. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Easter Island and tie it in with some of the other things. We're going to start just with some pretty pictures, if you would. Easter Island is a really beautiful island. Katie and I have spent some time there. Who's been to Easter Island? Oh, good. So some have. Seems to be more this side of the crowd. But it's a really beautiful island. It's known as Easter Island, or Isla de... I won't even try to pronounce it. Tapeta Tehenawad, and one translation of that is Navel of the World, sort of a center place. But it's a beautiful little island, sometimes referred to as the most remote inhabited location on Earth, and that's really true. It's a tiny island in the Pacific, over 2,000 kilometers from any other inhabited land. And why is it called Easter Island? Because it was discovered by the Dutch. Jacob Roggeveen and his little fleet of 3 ships, they first spotted it, or his crew first spotted it on Easter Sunday, 1722. So the name stuck. Interestingly, it's also called Rapa Nui. That's the modern name for it, or sometimes they'll say native name. It's actually a Polynesian name that wasn't adopted until the mid-19th century. So Rapa Nui, with all respect to the Rapa Nui or the Easter Islanders, Easter Island is actually an older name than Rapa Nui, and it's a very interesting history for the little island. It is dotted with, as I said here, thousands of mysteries. This is archaeological mysteries, and it's known most for the big moai, the big heads and torsos. And just to show you a few, they occur on what are known as Ahu complexes. This is, I'm just going to show you a few. This is Ahu Tahai complex. And you can see the moai there. They face inward. For the most part, they faced inward toward the center of the island. Sometimes people who haven't been there think they face looking at the ocean. No, they face inward. And they are absolutely incredible. The erected ones, they're on some of the ahus. They go up to about 10 meters tall, 75 tons. So this is no mean feat. This is nothing minor. And there's actually unfinished moai that's about 21 meters long. It's still in the quarry, and it weighs about 250 tons by the best estimate. So, I mean, these were incredible feats that they were doing on this little island. I'll tell you why they were doing it in a few minutes, according to the archaeologists. I'll let you think about that first. You can see who gets the right answer, according to the archaeology, standard archaeology. But here's another picture. And something else, you see how the moai are sitting along the coastline? Something that's actually very interesting and a lot of people don't pay as much attention to is that they did, I'm going to see if I can use this. Can you see that pointer in all of them? Someone suggested to me I try to figure out a way. Can you see that? Oh, in all three screens. Yeah. Anyway, you can see these seawalls, and these are incredible seawalls that they built. I mean, this is a major structural feat. A lot of times people don't focus on something like that, but they are building these seawalls in ancient times, I think because of rising sea levels. When were sea levels rising? At the end of the Ice Age. That's a clue right there as to, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. There's some of the moai. Now, they have been re-erected in modern times because they were standing, apparently, for the most part, when the island was, quote, first discovered by the Europeans in the 18th century. But then with slave raids, with diseases being brought to the island by the European social unrest, essentially what was genocide. There was lots of bad things happening in the 19th and early 20th century on the island. At one point, the island got down to a population of 110 or 111 people. We actually know the number, but it just depends on whether you count the one outsider as part of the population or not, who was doing the counting. So it's really had a devastating history in modern times, but I think has a very long, very ancient tradition, as we'll talk about. There's one of the moai. And these moai, see the eyes on it? Those are reconstructions, but that's probably what they looked like when they were actually at their height and glory. That is another moai, and that is Katie, my wife. In the foreground, she took most of these photos. Again, you can see how they're looking inward, and you can see the incredible seawalls that they built. And this is just a view of the edge of the island. It is a volcanic island, so this is all volcanic rock. And some of this looks natural, but when I'm looking at it carefully, I think some of these jetties and whatnot were actually constructed to break up the waves, to, again, protect their little island home, especially if you're talking about rising sea levels. And here it's a volcanic island. It has three major calderas in the three corners. Just show you, I'm a geologist, so I like this type of stuff. There's one of the calderas. They are considered dormant at the moment, but that's dormant relative to humans. I mean, they could go again. It is potentially, from a geologic perspective, relatively active. There's been no activity for, some centuries or millennia. There's just a view of it, and there we are on one of our visits. And this is Ahu Tongariki, which is one of the very impressive ahus. And there I'm standing by one of the smaller moai, and you see more in the background. And the moai, again, stand on what are known as ahus. Do you see the top knot or the hat, the red hat? Many of them, if not all of them, on the ahus had them originally, but these were lost. They were knocked down. They were quarried separately, hence a different color, and then erected on top of them. Here's a picture that Katie took, and we say, notice the two people. Do you see the two people there? You see them? Recognize him? That's me. Come on. And here's just some more. And notice, for instance, here, let's see if I can get the hang of this. Do you see the hands? Yeah, the hands. Okay, pay attention to that. I will show you that to you again, and it's been mentioned else. Otherwise, several of us have mentioned. There's a lot of cultural iconographic similarities around the world, including on remote little Easter Island that is supposed to have been the center. They say the center of the world. Other people might have said, in a Eurocentric view, in the 18th century, the center of nowhere. But I don't think we're talking a center of nowhere. I think we're talking a very important site. And just a few more views just for fun. They're really neat. They really are. You have to come visit. Oh, this is a personal thing. We're a little sunburnt. We're squinting into the sun. We may not look our best, but it was a long day because we just got married once. And we were going to get married again. Yeah. Weren't we, Katie? This was before the second marriage. Yeah, we had two. We were married on Easter Island. Why two marriages? One, because one was a legal marriage, and then one was a traditional Rapa Nui marriage, which we wore different clothes for that. I wore a bark cloth cape and whatnot. Didn't include a picture. Anyway, here's the quarry. The Raku Quarry. And many of the moai originate from here. Not all of the moai originate from here. Can you start to see their little heads popping up? Yeah. They're so cute. They're big, but they look cute from here. And you can go and you can see them. Here we are walking around close up. Just to give you a feel for it, there we are. We were quickly told after this photograph that we were standing too close to the moa. I didn't want to back up and knock him over or something. And there we are walking along, and I mean, they're very interesting. Notice that they tend to have long ears, extended ears, and I won't get into it today, but there was considered to be two populations on Easter Island according to the myths, the legends, the long ears and the short ears. And they had different roles. The short ears were sort of subservient to the long ears, that type of thing. And a lot of people took this, quote, naively, according to modern archaeologists, as suggesting that there were different populations on the island, different ethnic groups from different origins. I'll come back to that. Here's an interesting one. Do you see how it's torso, and this should be the head, but then there's another torso and another head? Do you see that? It's very strange. Were they, was it almost like a totem pole type situation, or was this one big head once that they then start carving into a smaller head in another body? I just throw it out. It's interesting. And here is, I'm talking to one of the archaeologists, and this, do you see this has not been quarried out completely. It was just left in position. And he's explaining, didn't I tell you, think about what the purpose of the moai was? Okay, here we learned the purpose of the moai firsthand from a specialist. I'm not making fun of anyone. So what's the answer? Anyone know the answer before I get to it? Come on. One guess. Protection, I hear it. Worship. Guardians? No, you're all wrong. It's so simple. It was busy work. Because it's a small island. You have to keep the population in check. I mean, you have to give them something to do. It's like public works. I'm not making this up. We were told this. And he's showing how you take little rocks and you can just chip away. And, it keeps them busy for days, for weeks, for months, for years. And then you don't have a revolt on your hands. No, I was going to say all joking aside, but we're not joking here. No, that is one explanation. Yes, there's other explanations about how it was ancestors, and it was the clan. Each clan had their own ahu and the different tribes. And, I'm not going to get into all that now. But it really was suggested. You can find this in the literature that in part was to keep them busy on this small, remote island. Otherwise, you'd have a huge uprising on your hand. Here you can see this guy hasn't been liberated yet. Here is one of the larger ones. Can you see him along there? Do you see his body? Head? Do you see that? Everyone see it? He hasn't been fully carved out and removed, but if he had been, he'd be about 21 meters long or tall and about 250 tons. So, I mean, they had some major plans before things ended. Now, remember, most of them have what length ears? Long. Here is one, very rare, with short ears. Furthermore, unlike most of them, he actually has what? Legs. He's kneeling on his legs, but this is a very unusual one. And there are fragments of other ones like this, so he's not unique, but he's very unusual. And he was actually not discovered until the 1950s by someone you've already heard his name, and a fellow named Thor Heyerdahl got interested in Easter Island, actually had probably was the second actual archaeological expedition, because Catherine Routledge did one in the early 20th century, although some people dismiss it as, quote, not modern. But he and his crew discovered this and excavated it. It was found at the quarry along with the other ones, and he was a person that spoke his mind, had his own concepts, his own ideas, and among other things, he suggested that people were traveling back and forth across the oceans in ancient times, very, very ancient times. He applied this to Easter Island, and he suggested that things like, I'm going to go back one, things like this fellow looked very similar to things like these fellows. Where are these from? This is from Bolivia in this case, Tiwanaku and La Paz. Here's some that we looked at, Katie and I looked at, compared to our photograph of the Moai. Do you see some similarities? Yeah, and Thor Heyerdahl suggested there were similarities like this. He suggested, as have others since him, that there are other similarities, and you've seen some of these already. This is Ahuvinapu on Easter Island. And this is, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, but Sacsayhuaman in Peru, that is me, if you don't recognize me. And they are, again, very, very similar. And Thor Heyerdahl insisted that, well, you know, it's not impossible that South Americans were going to Easter Island and vice versa. He actually pointed out situations in South America where it seemed to be that Easter Island artifacts have been found in pre-contact contexts, more or less before Europeans could have brought them there. Academics dismissed it. This was all very controversial. And I have two slides that I call Destroying the Dogma, Easter Island Destroying the Dogma. The dogma in this case, the standard explanation, the standard academic view is that the origin of the Easter Islands is purely and solely Polynesian. That's a status quo view. In fact, one of the great, at least he considers himself great, Easter Island scholars. No, I should not say it that way, because he is a great Easter Island scholar, even though I disagree with him on numerous points. He's a man named Stephen Roger Fisher, and he wrote Attacking Thor Heyerdahl's Theories. Easter Island's one and only settlers were not South Americans. In the last quarter of the 20th century, this long contentious issue was resolved once and for all by the cumulative scientific evidence that confirmed Easter Island's exclusively Polynesian patrimony. More or less, they were all coming from the West. There's this whole dogma about how the Polynesians moved progressively further to the east, coming from the West. Their last outpost was Easter Island. So it had to be late, and it had to be just Polynesian. Everyone follow? And people like Thor Heyerdahl were a real thorn in the standard academics' sides, if we could put it that way, because he was saying something different in the Thor Heyerdahl group, if you would. We're really lambasted, and poor Thor Heyerdahl, he's now passed away in 2002. But guess what? Things like this came out just within the last year. Genomic studies, for instance, totally independent evidence now indicates, and I've looked at a number of these studies very carefully, that in fact in the indigenous population there is not only Polynesian, there's actually Polynesian and South American genes. So I think Thor Heyerdahl in this case has been vindicated that yes, he was right all along. There is contact, there was contact in ancient times between the two sides. And somehow I don't think it was just busy work either, that they were just carving the moai. Back to the island, here's an Orongo village. Aren't these interesting looking? Yeah, I mean, they look like sort of bunkers or fallout shelters, don't they? I think it's more than they just sort of look like it, but they're these unusual houses, they're these unusual shelter-type structures. I mean, they're really sort of neat. What's the classic? You want to hear what the archaeologists say these were for? Or at least one, what? Some were ceremonial burials, some tie into like, this, I don't know, sweat lodges, but they don't really argue that much. The one I like best, because it's so improbable in my mind, is that they were going in there to protect themselves from their enemies. Now you gotta realize that these are very small little entrances. It's very small inside. I couldn't stand up inside. There's not much room in there. And if you're going in there and barricading yourself in, your enemy doesn't have to do much. They just wait till you starve to death. Or if they really want to be ambitious, this is made out of stone slabs that are not cemented or anything. They can just sort of peel the top off as, what do they call it? Shooting fish or stabbing fish in a barrel? Yeah. So anyway, not to make fun of things. There's some pictures of them. But something that was found in one of these, found at Orongo, and basically the house was built around it, so that would suggest that this is an older piece that was used and reused. In fact, the carving on the back is probably later than the original piece, so it's something that was very ancient, probably, held in high esteem. Is this basalt moai, which has now been liberated from Easter Island. It was liberated in the 19th century and now resides in the British Museum, which, yeah, there's a little bit of bitterness about that among certain people on the island. But it's really beautiful. And the thing is, it is carved out of basalt, very hard basalt. Can you see how finely it's worked? Really beautifully worked. Most of the moai are not basalt. The ones that we saw in the quarry, they're made out of tuffs, of volcanic tuff or tufa stone, which is much more friable is one word I might use for it, much easier to carve. Not that it's easy to carve per se, but it's not the same as carving a basalt. Everyone follow? And the second thing is, it's a small island. No one has ever located definitively where the basalt quarry was for carving these basalt moai. There are a few basalt moai, but the quarry hasn't been found despite the small size of the island. Where do I think it is? I'll get to it right now, but I'll reinforce it later. I think it's under the ocean, under the water. It would have been stratigraphically and geographically lower, and if during the Ice Age or during earlier times, if the water levels were lower, that's where I would expect geologically, given the stratigraphy, given the nature of the rocks on the island, to find really good basalt quarries. Here is an old photograph. It's a pre-1924 photograph, but can you see where I've got my arrow? Do you see him? His face is not towards you, his back is towards you, but this, in fact, is another basalt moai. The basalt moais tend to be relatively small, so my height or a bit taller, and he has been built into the wall of a later ahu, which means he is older. He's being reused. I forget who was pointing out before, but when you have things reused like this, you know they're older. Now here's another one. I've got my arrow on his face. Recognize him? That's Thor Heyerdahl. And he went back to the island in the 80s, and lo and behold, this is a very small but very beautiful basalt moai. You see him there? No, it's actually a her. You see her there. And as it says there, in 1956, they found the body deep in the sand at Anakina Beach on Easter Island, and then the head was found in 1988 under the Ahu Wall. So again, this indicates a much older one. Here she is put together. Isn't she strange looking? Yeah, and she's now in the museum on Easter Island. Here's another picture of her from a couple of views. She is very strange, isn't she? But she's considered a she because she has female attributes, you see? Yeah, breasts. And if you notice, she's a little warm, but you see her hands and arms? Everyone see that? Yeah, so very similar. Actually, something I'll come back to it. Who did you see with hands and arms like that yesterday? Göbekli Tepe. Again, Göbekli Tepe and Urfaman. So, as I said, I think these quarries probably go back stratigraphically lower, geographically lower, much older. Interestingly, Jacques Cousteau. Have people heard about Jacques Cousteau? If you haven't, where have you been? Yeah. We were told on the island that when Jacques Cousteau was there and they were diving around the island, they found some weird basalt formations with, very regular cuts in them, which sure sounded like quarries. So if you'd like to donate some money for the research, I'm serious. One thing that we want to do is to try to go there and to dive and to find these, because these could be a major, major discovery and help really rewrite things. Here's Anakina in 2010. There you can see some of the moai. They've been re-erected with their, we'll just call them hats or top knots, headdresses on them. And this is from 1987. Again, good old Thor Heyerdahl. He got all kinds of things. He got permission to do all kinds of things back in the day. They won't let you do this now. But look, he excavated well below, and look at what he found. These beautiful, sophisticated walls that are much stratigraphically lower, much older. And can you see this now? You can see it on the slide, but a lot of this stuff they were forced to fill back in. I was told at one point, well, why did they have to fill it back in? Oh, it was dangerous. Someone might trip and fall, get hurt. Well, safety first. And I think you saw this slide before. This is Thor Heyerdahl. This is from the 1910s, 19-teens. Another one that was excavated. And yes, they have bodies. They have arms and hands. They don't have legs except for the kneeling moai that I showed you before. But this, as a geologist, I'll make this very simple. Depth of sedimentation means they're very what? Old. And some people have suggested to me, well, no, there were huge landslides or tsunamis. Well, you've got these big, tall guys. If there's a landslide or tsunami, they tend to do what? Fall over. Other people have told me that, they were digging holes and dumping them in the holes and filling them up quickly. That makes sense, I guess, if you need lots of busy work. Because you not only carve it, you have to dig the hole, then you have to fill it up. Actually, looking at, as best I've been able to do as firsthand as a geologist, I don't believe for a second that this was dug out. You can actually see in rock when things have been dug out, when it's been filled back in, that type of thing. And it doesn't work. No. In fact, in some of their reports, they're even very clear, I say archaeological reports, that no, this is natural sedimentation that filled in after it was erected. So I have here my slide, just so you know, a little wooden Easter Island ancient carving. But isn't he so cute? Yeah, I just like him. Anyway, standard chronology, Easter Island was not inhabited. This is what the status quo people say. Not until 1500 to maybe as recently as 800 years ago. A lot of archaeologists nowadays will tell you that possibly Easter Island was not inhabited until about 1200 AD or so. Really late, but this makes sense to them because, again, they have this whole concept of the Polynesians spreading from island to island, and you have to go from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, and the last one they got to was Easter Island. They couldn't just jump from one to the other and miss the ones in between. And Polynesians, they had great navigating skills, but it was still, within a certain time frame. I would say that you don't get this depth of sediment in such a short period of time. To me, geologically, that disproves the chronology right. There are at least questions it heavily. But interestingly, another paper in Quaternary Science Reviews, this is a geology journal, came out, and it has maybe an imposing title, Vegetation Changes in Human Settlement of Easter Island During the Last Millennia, a multi-proxy study of the late Raraku sediments. But when you read it, when you analyze it, it really has, from a status quo point of view, some amazing results. For instance, they come to the conclusion that Easter Island colonization had to go back at least to 450 BC. And this is pre-status quo people now saying this, so that's doubling it or so, and I wonder how much further it could go back. This is from their paper. They found, among other things, plants native to South America that they interpret as only being able to be transported to the island by humans, and things that come typically with humans are typically used with humans, and they occur in the record in 450 BC. They see what are known as charcoal changes in the record, evidence of changes in the ecology by 450 BC, and furthermore, these vegetation changes, as I said, come from South America, so that reinforces who? Thor Heyerdahl and what he had been saying all along. So once again, he seems to be vindicated. Okay, moving on to some other things. Quickly, Arango, at Arango, we have these birdmen, petroglyphs and motifs. Can you see some of them there? Okay, this is from the 1920s. They would go and they'd chalk them in so you could see them better. Not allowed to do this anymore. But you can see the birdman there. There you can see what's known as the Birdman. And this ties in with the Easter Island. There, you see some more there? They had a competition. This went up until 19th, at least it was recorded in the early 20th century, where they would go out, they would, the sooty tern, and as well as other birds, but the sooty tern for this particular competition is a migratory bird that would come to the island periodically. They would go out, and the first one to get the egg, you may have heard about this before, would win prestige and honor, was the, quote, Birdman, for his clan, for his tribe, for his local chief. And there's sharks in these waters, and it was a pretty arduous competition to get that first egg and to bring it back unbroken. But I think it probably holds more importance. I think a lot of the traditions, a lot of the myths that we have throughout indigenous and ancient cultures, they hide, if you would. They go back to earlier things, and we'll get to that. The other thing about Easter Island is, and it's a great mystery of linguistics, is they have an indigenous script, indigenous, what's known as a Rongo. Now, people argue about this in mainstream academia. Some people, we spoke to archaeologists who say that, yes, they think this goes back a very long time, maybe thousands of years. There were Rongo schools, as they called it, recorded in the 19th century. Other archaeologists and scholars like Stephen Fisher, who I gave you a quote from, he says, no, this is basically the Easter Islanders seeing Europeans writing. They got the concept, written language. These Europeans have written language, so then they quickly invented their own written language. Yeah. I honestly don't buy that. I think it has a more profound meaning, and this actually gets to what I consider, what when I say we, in this case, Katie and I consider to be a piece of the puzzle as to the demise of civilization at the end of the last ice age. And this gets back, I'm going to repeat just a little bit to both refresh your memory. I find teaching that helps students. And also for those that weren't here yesterday, because I know a few people missed it, what is civilization? How do we define civilization, how far back it goes? And you should know this now. I could ask you to take out a piece of paper and give you a quiz on it, right? But V. Gordon Childe, remember we talked about how he really formalized the concept of civilization, at least for archaeologists and anthropologists, and that we go through these stages of savagery, barbarism, little cultivation, agriculture, and then civilization. And most archaeologists would say, well, Easter Islanders, they were barbarians at the best when they were, if not downright savages, when they were discovered by the Europeans. And of course, it was the Europeans who would bring great civilization to the island, including Christianity, which basically told them to burn all their rongo because you don't want those nasty heathen tablets around with weird writing on them. So anyway, civilization, high civilization. Remember I talked yesterday about my work on the Sphinx, and civilization is supposed to have gone back to 3500 BC. The Sphinx was supposed to be 2500 BC, but that doesn't hold up. And I mentioned yesterday how this began to crack for me, and just for those who weren't here, I was basing on geological analysis of water erosion despite the hyper-arid desert. And you can see the different types of weathering, the different types of geology on the Sphinx versus everything else from Old Kingdom times from circa 2500 BC. There's a huge mismatch, and everyone should know it indicates, in my opinion, very evidently and evidentially, that the Sphinx goes back to a much earlier period. Everyone remember this? Everyone got the argument? And it goes back, and we know that North Africa and the Sahara was much more moist, a very different climate, very different vegetation much earlier. And remember my timeline, I pushed the Sphinx back to an earlier period, and they tried to crucify me academically, I guess is one way to say, because this was before civilization could occur according to the paradigm. It wasn't pleasant at the time. And they wanted to know where the cooperation was, and remember the cooperation that I pointed out yesterday was Göbekli Tepe, which is now started to be excavated by Klaus Schmidt and the late Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, who pushed it back, Göbekli Tepe, to even this earlier period. So we have very good evidence of civilization before civilization is supposed to have occurred. And just to remind you about Göbekli Tepe, really has all the, it was a stunning site. And I put in here, I don't know if you noticed that that's slightly different wording. I would say it shatters the paradigm. It shatters the paradigm of when civilization is supposed to have originated, where it's supposed to have originated, and how far back it goes, and what is going on. And we have to look at this much earlier period, which I'm going to continue with right now. And Göbekli Tepe has all the hallmarks of civilization, including pillars with hands and the position of the arms and hands, position of the hands and the belt. Remember that? And yet they don't have heads. I didn't really stress this yesterday. That is where the head would be. If they wanted to carve a head, could they have carved a head? Yeah. Remember, I suggested that this might actually be a representation of, do people remember what constellation? Yeah, Orion, which of course is Osiris in Egypt, etc. So Orion, Osiris, that region of the sky seems to be very, very important. And I argued that we have evidence of cataclysm followed by intentional burial. Remember the pillars that were knocked over. And Göbekli Tepe, as I pointed out yesterday, was intentionally buried by 8,000 BC, end of the last ice age. They ended up putting as much energy into covering it over as they did to build it, and the question is why. Now, coming back to Easter Island and Göbekli Tepe, I want to point out a few things, including some themes, some common themes. If you start comparing, are there a lot of similarities potentially? Well, standard archaeologists are all going to say this is what? Coincidental, nonsense, etc. But I don't know. I think we need to look at these things. Here's our female Moai. Remember Urfaman? Yeah. If these had been found at the same site, would that be semi-believable? Yeah. I think so. It's very interesting, too, that they don't do so much small stonework in Easter Island, but they have these figures which couldn't help but remind me of small stone figures in Turkey. Some of the similarities won't push this too far. Or the headdresses on Easter Island. We couldn't help notice in Turkey, the whirling dervishes, the classic headdresses. I don't know what to think of it. Here we have the bird or the birdman motif. You remember the birdman from Easter Island? And if you look at this pillar in particular, sometimes that's referred to as a vulture with a sun disk, or some people interpret that as a skull or a head. But you have these similar, I think, motifs. Here's on the Rongo Rongo. We'll call it bird or birdman motif. Keep these in mind because I think they have other significance. Here is a Rongo Rongo detail versus figures on a tablet found in Turkey. Here's a Rongo Rongo tablet. Again, I want you right now just get these images. And again, looking at this in a little more detail. And I think that all these pieces absolutely connect ultimately in terms of these ancient civilizations, these ancient cultures, and again, understanding, and this is something I've been interested in actually since the 1980s, as to what is happening at the end of the last ice age. Yes, it continues to be very, very controversial. To remind you, or for a few of you who weren't here, there are weird things going on geologically at the end of the last ice age. Everyone remember that? Because you've heard about it a couple of times now. There's a cold snap, if you would, for 1,200 years, and the dating I'm using is based on the Greenland ice core data. A cold snap that starts about 10,900 BC, that's known as the Younger Dryas, the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and then the sudden warming at 9,700 BC. This is a diagram you saw before. It was very cold, started to get warmer, then you have this incredible cold snap, and then this incredible warm spell. So this is what you have to explain, this 1,200-year period. It gets cold quickly, and even more quickly, it gets warm again at 9,700. And very, very quick. This is based on some of the high-resolution Greenland ice core. I don't want you to even try to read this. But this was published in Science, which is, as a side note, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Do you remember who sponsored the debate on the age of the Sphinx where they wanted to lynch me? It was public. This is the same group. Now, if they had had a paper like this back in 1992, I suspect they would have maybe suppressed it, should we say? But I think things are changing now. And what this suggests, and this is one of the early papers, and there's more since then, that these transitions were incredibly quick. Particularly the one at 9,700 BC. There have since this paper, this came out in 2000, this one particular one, 2008, within the last 6 months, some indicating that the transition was within weeks or even days. So very, very quick transitions, and part of the question is, how do you explain that? And we talked, you've heard now from a couple of us about the comet, that there's a possibility that was a comet, or some people have suggested that there was a comet. I was very much into comets. especially when I wrote this book, Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. And this came out in 2003. I talk about cometary intervention in civilization, if you would. And yes, there are a series of comets that we can document. But on the other hand, not everything is necessarily a comet. And I always was a little bothered. In 2007, a paper was published suggesting that the Younger Dryas was initiated by a comet. And at the time, 2007, I thought it was a very interesting concept, but I was a little bothered because it was basically prolonging the Ice Age. It didn't seem to me that it was really what was necessary scientifically to ultimately bring the catastrophes, the faunal extinctions, the other extinctions, the factor that would make those occur. So it bothered me a little bit, and it really did not address the question of why the Ice Age ended so dramatically 1,200 years later. You've seen this. Oh, actually, I showed a version of this before. When I say Science News got it wrong, however you view the comet, whether it was a comet or not, the Ice Age did not end by a comet, because the comet that's being suggested is 10,900 BC, not 9,700 BC. Is everyone with me? Yeah. So even if it was a comet at 10,900 BC, and as I mentioned yesterday, that's been seriously questioned, but there's a lot of arguments on both sides. The event that ended the Younger Dryas in 9,700 BC is a different event, and there could be a couple of different things going on there. This is the, I think you saw a picture of this before, but this is the original paper for the last round, because people had actually suggested this earlier than 2007. I mean, I'd heard theories about comets back in the 90s and 80s, much more speculative. This was by Firestone et al. In 2007. The YDIH stands for Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and they suggested that a comet hit, and that explained basically the cooling features, because you would melt the ice, you would release cold water, you would throw up debris into the atmosphere, which would have a cooling effect, that type of thing. Almost immediately, people started arguing against it. So for instance, they pointed out, and I'm actually convinced because, from looking at the mineralogy, that some of these arguments against it are valid. Other people suggested, for instance, geophysical research letters, and also in proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that they'd misidentified minerals. Some of these are almost funny. The headline, fungus not comet or catastrophe accounts for carbonaceous spherules. Basically, they're saying that things were misidentified and it's not impact. Another one, no evidence of nanodiamonds in Younger Dryas sediments to support an impact event. The problem is identifying the mineralogy of what are known as nanodiamonds that would possibly suggest a comet is very, very difficult. It's very easy to make mistakes with that, and that's basically the argument. Then counter-argument in 2013 by the comet proponents was that you had these impact spirals in massive amounts across basically North America, and you heard about this already, into South America, into Europe, and the Middle East. Just so you know, this has nothing to do with it other than this is the example of a field, what's known as a tektite field, strewn field, from about 800,000 years ago, which they were comparing it to their hypothetical. This one's very well established. This is their hypothetical one. The problem is that people then countered in the literature that this is not how a comet explosion would occur, given the dynamics and the physics of the comet that's being proposed, and also that a lot of these things that they called siliceous spherules and scoria-like objects, basically, that's a fancy way of saying that you heat up sand and other elements and you form little droplets. and that was suggested because of a comet impact, that these don't necessarily indicate comets. They could form under other conditions. And furthermore, that they're not consistently dated to the beginning of the Younger Dryas. So I'm just trying to give you both sides of it, that what these arguments involve. So for instance, a couple more headlines: Proceedings of National Academy of Science, arguing about the airburst physics. And this one I like, anthropogenic. What does anthropogenic mean? Human origin. They suggest that there's a human origin of the siliceous scoria droplets. And from the Pleistocene, Holocene archaeological sites in northern Syria, what they're saying is that these were formed under archaeological conditions from burning, that type of thing, caused by humans in both the late Pleistocene, more or less within the Younger Dryas, and also post-Younger Dryas time, but they're not all the same age. This is some of those little things. Do you see them? These are a couple millimeters in size. These are the little siliceous scoria-like objects, as people call them different names. And the argument is exactly how do these form, under what conditions, and what is the dating of them. So this is what some of the argument involves. Key test. Now this is something that is very near and dear to me as a geologist, something that's sometimes known as event stratigraphy. Event. Everyone knows what an event is? Okay, event stratigraphy looks at unusual events, whether it's a volcanic eruption or a comet hitting or a solar outburst that I'll get to, but unusual events. Everyone follow what I'm saying? And if you have an unusual event that happens like that, more or less geologically in a flash, which means a volcanic eruption, do they hit really quickly? Yes, or a tsunami from an earthquake, that type of thing. You should find stratigraphic markers, geologic markers of that. And if it's from one event, they should all be the same time horizon. Everyone follow? And so if this was a comet and one event, this is the concept of event stratigraphy, they should be all the same time horizon. And what has been argued by some of the non-comet proponents is that the chronological evidence fails to support, I'm reading the headline here from Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, fails to support claim of an isochronous, that means at the same time, widespread layer of cosmic impact indicators dated to beginning of the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. What they found is that they claimed that the other researchers were looking at things that were spread over several thousands of years, including only a few hundred years ago to 13, 14, 15,000 years ago. So again, the argument continues. It's something that is very interesting to me. I will tell you that right now, I wish it were a comet, but I'm sort of siding against it. And I think there are other things. So if it wasn't a comet, what could happen? And this gets back to Easter Island. What could have caused cold snap globally? One possibility is we have to look at the sun. It turns out geologically, solar activity and climate on Earth are very, very closely tied together. A lot of people don't want to hear that. In another context, I could get in big trouble for that, because what is the modern dogma about global warming? It's caused by man, and we are to blame. We are the evil ones. Now, I've written about environmental science. I'm a co-author of environmental science textbook. But when you look at the data, there's a very strong correlation between solar activity over the last hundreds of thousands and millions of years and climate on Earth. Doesn't mean we should be spewing out greenhouse gases and using lots of gasoline. There are other problems with that, pollution problems, but not everything is as simple as people want to make it out to be. What could cause a dramatic warming? This is really what I want to focus on now, and I believe a solar explosion. The science now, in my opinion, points to the sun. We've been talking about the sun and the influence of the sun in other ways. Does the sun affect your consciousness? It absolutely does. It absolutely does. The sun has a lot of radiation coming from it, and I don't mean just bad radiation, but electromagnetic radiation from it. There are all kinds of correlations I won't get into now between us, even mental states, and the sun. But the sun undergoes activity on different scales, different levels. People have maybe heard about the 11-year sunspot cycle. Yeah, almost everyone's heard about that, but there are cycles on the order of centuries. There are cycles on the order of millennia. There are cycles on the order of tens of millennia. So there are many different cycles. The sun is a typical star in its class, and they're not consistent. One of the last vestiges, one could argue, of Aristotelianism in our society today among most people is they look up at the sky and they think the sun is unchanging. Everyone with me? They don't think it's going to change dramatically from day to day or within their lifetime. That's not necessarily true. The sun is not as stable as people tend to believe. Sometimes undergoes major solar outbursts, ejects what are known as powerful plasma discharges. This is plasma. This is electrically charged particles. Arguably, most of the universe is plasma. It is electrically charged particles. It's not atomic, or I should say molecular, the way you think of it. One way to put it is the states of matter are solid, liquid, gas, and what? Light, plasma, basically plasma. And so much is plasma, which is a different thing. We don't tend to think about that in everyday life. Such plasma outbursts could cause massive destruction, a major one on Earth, dramatically warm the climate, melt glaciers, and they could end the last ice age. And there's now data from Greenland ice core data, sediment core data, lunar data, which I talk about in the book, that in 9700 BC, the sun was extremely active, and it correlates with this massive global warming. Everyone knows about plasma storms a little bit? Yeah, because this is the what? Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis, things like that. Now, a very good astrophysicist, but he was sort of laughed at for making these comments when he first did. His name was Thomas Gold. He's now deceased, and he pointed out as early as the 1960s, this is a quote from him, it's an important quote, in the case of a big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. He was talking about plasma or charged particles, and it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level. It would take the form of a series of sparks burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he talked about how it would cause massive destruction on the surface of the planet. Of course, if you were in an ice age, it would melt the glaciers. It would change the climate. Everyone with me? Don't need to beat this in the ground. And he said, among other things, you should look for vitrification. What is vitrification? I'm sure you've heard of it before. Melted rock. And I've been working on this, and you can find it in different places at the right time. That is 97 or so 100 BC. This is me, I don't know, a few years ago. And I'm in Scotland. And do you see what's in my hands there? That is vitrified rock, which I believe goes back to this event in particular, the dating on it. You find in other places vitrified rock. This is not necessarily, I don't want to make a claim this is a 9700 BC event, but you find, what we probably are going to find is there's a cycle of solar outbursts going back in time because the sun goes through this periodicity. This is in the Geology Museum in Cairo, actually. This is known as the Libyan desert glass, which occurs in the Western Desert. One thing that a solar outburst would do is vitrify massive areas when you have a big, where it sets down in certain areas. It could also cause essentially massive, virtually instantaneous desertification, causing of deserts. Everyone with me? Okay, I can only go say so much at the moment. Aside from ice cores, sediment cores, lunar data, ancient civil vitrification, additional evidence from solar outbursts at the end of the last ice age, I believe, occurs in what are known as petroglyphs. I mentioned this briefly yesterday, but I'm going to go into more detail now because it's very important, and other archaeological records. I want to come back to this man who is instrumental in this work, Dr. Anthony Perrott, the plasma physicist at Los Alamos. He studies plasma. Here's a picture of plasma. Everyone's seen plasma, right? I mean, you know, well, they're turned off, but what do they call fluorescent tubes? Those have plasma in them. So he studied this, and as I mentioned briefly yesterday, he was studying rock art just as a hobby, you know, New Mexico area and elsewhere in the West. And he found that the plasma configurations, put it this way, what you would see in the sky as he modeled it by computers, what you would see in the sky if we had a major solar outburst tomorrow, you would see these weird configurations, not exactly lightning bolts, but these plasma configurations. They would take on certain definitive shapes. Everyone with me? He suggested that essentially that happened in the ancient past, and people saw them, they anthropomorphized them. So does this sort of look like a human with its arms up? Yeah, and maybe, I'm not sure what's going between his legs, maybe he's male. And with little donuts on the side, he was finding these stick figure type figures in the archaeological record, in the petroglyph record, and saying, no, this is not just people's imagination. No, this is not just nonsense. You find them consistently in over 130 countries, that this represents something real that people were recording, that they were seeing in the sky that was affecting them and was of vital importance to them. So he started documenting what these could look like. You have stick figure men with dots on their sides. That would be something like this down here. You have, very interestingly, he pointed out, what become essentially stick figure men with bird heads. Remember the concept of bird-headed men? You find it in cultures around the world. Could it have been inspired by something like this? You have these donut, cascading, cylindrical type shapes. This is some of his experimental data. These are some of his actual collection of petroglyphs from around the world, everywhere from Italy to, what does that say, Armenia? Arizona, UAE, Spain, and this is caused by synchrotron radiation. I won't get into exactly what that is, but when you have this major solar outburst, normally people, if you look around, does everyone have dots on their sides sort of floating? So he said, no, people are not just imagining this consistently. This is something real. Here's some more pictures of different things. Some of these take forms. They look like they have multiple arms, etc. Here's some more. Here you can see some of the bird-headed man that tie in with that, the birds' heads. And this, Katie and I were in Norway, I think it was last year. We got to see some of the ancient petroglyphs there, and you get, I think, ones that fall into these same categories, these same patterns, going back to the end of the last ice age, or right at the terminal point. Getting back to, remember the Rongo-Rongo? That little digression. The Rongo-Rongo, Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, noticed that the Rongo-Rongo characters look like the plasma petroglyphs. We think this was inspired. This is the inspiration for the Rongo-Rongo. So here you have the bird-headed man on the Rongo-Rongo. See that? And we think it was inspired by that. Yes, maybe the Rongo-Rongo was used for other things later to record for more mundane purposes, but we suggest this was being inspired. Here you have the stick figures with the dots on the sides. Here you get in the Rongo-Rongo the equivalent. And interestingly, in the Rongo-Rongo, if I could figure out my pointer here, do you see how you have these figures in the Rongo-Rongo, which are very close to the experimental, what you get in major plasma discharge. And I want to mention this, the birdman in Egypt. You have birdmen in Egypt all over the place? Yes, I think some of this may be going back. I just hypothesize it that some of this may be a collective memory. It may be, these would be incredible experiences at the end of the last ice age. Could some of this have been remembered, been passed on in the art? Is something inheritance. Oh, I wanted to make a quick stop here, quick change just for a second, tying in with Egypt too. Several times it's come up, the whole business of stars and light and our connection to stars. And I don't know if you've realized this, but there's some serious work suggesting that stars and the sun in particular, and this sounds crazy, but I can say this in this audience, correct? And also, this is one of the things when you're married to someone who's not a scientist, but very intelligent, and also has a very good understanding of astrology. Now, is astrology academically accepted or acceptable? No, but someone who has very strong interest and knowledge of astrology and metaphysics. But there's actually serious work suggesting that consciousness, it pervades the universe, pervades things. There are different ways to have consciousness expressed. And I will say bluntly, I don't think we can simply dismiss the concept that non-biological entities as we know, biological entities, lack consciousness. They may have it in a different way. They may express it in a different way. But getting back to stars, this has been mentioned before. Stars, from an astronomical point of view, are collapsing hydrogen clouds, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, but the whole concept that we're stardust and we are hydrogen and other things. What are we mostly actually? Water. Well, we're carbon-based, but lots of water, and if you look at carbon molecules, do they have incredible numbers of hydrogen in them? Yes, we are a lot of hydrogen, a lot of water, which of course is H2O. With hydrogen, Katie came up with what she talks about as the G theory, which I mentioned in the book. I talk about in the book, her theory, and give her credit, of course. Her G theory, G for God or the Grand Architects or Masonic, or Cassimi. She's also called it Cassimi when it was first published in Italian. This book came out in Italian before an English edition, called it Cassimi, which is an astrological Arabic term for heart of the sun. But the concept is that her concept is that when we die, we release hydrogen, that it can collect in space. Where do stars come from? They collapse down again from hydrogen. I talk about in the book that there's now good evidence that hydrogen can encode information, which is, one could argue, the basis of memories and personalities and consciousness. I think, what is it, Dr. Emoto? Yeah, very similar with water, which is primarily hydrogen, or we've talked about Dr. Vogel and the Vogel crystals and encoding information. So it's a funny thing that we may be on the verge of proving the Egyptians and other cultures right, that when they were talking about stars and having consciousness and we become stars or we're going back up to stars. So there's a lot of things going on. I just wanted to tie a few things there. But you can read about this more in the book. Oh, can I tell you a personal thing? Say yes. Yes. I told at least one person this in the hall the other day, or in the bookstore. My mother's deceased. She died, well, I want to say 2012. I should remember these things, right? Yeah. And I never do this. I never do this otherwise. And I'm very private, until the book is really done. I don't let people read manuscripts or that type of thing. But this book I was putting together, and I just had this, I felt compelled to send it to my mother in manuscript form. And she read it. She loved it. She particularly liked this. Of course, that was Katie's work. And then she passed away. And I was so happy that, I had sent it to her before, because it was just sort of out of my nature. And a lot of other people have commented on this. I do want to mention, I don't feel like I want to plug the book now, but you're going to go buy a copy right after this anyway. I talk about a lot more things than just civilization and solar outbursts and physics. I actually get into lo and behold, metaphysics and parapsychology and that type of thing. So anyway, getting back to the stars and the sun and the ancients, I think they both feared and revered the sun for many, many good reasons, including what was happening at the end of the last ice age, and if you would, sort of collective memories of somehow deep down as to what happened. Could this tie in a little bit with the Nazca lines too, and the glyphs and what we see there? I just throw this out because I think this is an audience where we can try and make connections. Easter Island Rongo Rongo is there, and these are some of the Nazca glyphs. Nazca hands. This is an Easter Island petroglyph with the hands in the sky. Okay, we've had some minor solar outbursts. If you go up very far to high latitudes, can you sometimes see a good aurora borealis or good northern or southern lights if you're going down south? I know one astrophysicist, and he talked about seeing a beautiful, sort of fairly major one at one point. What did it look like? He described it as pairs of hands up in the sky. Yeah, isn't that amazing? You know, he said, oh, it looked just like that, just like that. You know, I don't want to do both hands right now. Pairs of hands. Interestingly, on Easter Island, one name for the island, and this was a legend collected by the anthropologist Maziri in 1963, so long before I was thinking about such things, because I was quite young at the time. He collected the legend. Well, he said that one name for the island and the statues was eyes gazing at the sky. I'll also mention that when the Chileans in the 19th century were collecting some of the last Rongo Rongo, they asked the people, well, what does this mean? What does it say? And they said, oh, you know, basically we don't know. They sort of stared blankly, and they said, well, something about up there has something to do with the sky. Here's a legend. In the days of Roko Roko Hitau, who's supposed to be one of the legendary kings, the sky fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, the sky has fallen in the days of King Roko Roko Hitau. He took hold. He waited a given time. The sky returned. It went away, and it stayed up there. And I think this is just the type of thing you might see during a major solar outburst, but it would cause damage on the earth. Also, always like that, I'm sure as a politician here, he waited, things went away, then he took credit for fixing everything. So were they looking up at the sky? In the past, very severe examples, I suggest that's the case. So putting some things together, this is one of Dr. Perrot's papers with one of his colleagues, and he's written a number of papers on this, that there is this evidence for an intense solar outburst in prehistory, is the way he put it. This intense solar outburst, he's never really pinned it down to a date. He suggested that there's several, which I would agree with, but one that was really, really major, you know what date I'm going to put on it? Come on. 9700 BC. I think everything is pointing to a major one at 9700 BC. And looking at our little chart here, that's what ended, I believe, the end of the last ice age. Now remember, the Younger Dryas started earlier, so we're not talking about the beginning of the Younger Dryas and a possible comet or whatever's happening there, but the end of the Younger Dryas, 9700 BC. Siddha, people remember what Siddha is? I think I mentioned it yesterday. We believe Katie came up with the, I love the acronym, SIDA, Solar-Induced Dark Age, that essentially these early civilizations were wiped out by this solar outburst. We went into a long dark age, if you would, before civilization reemerged. And the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, Plato, they were not crazy. They knew that there was an earlier cycle of civilization. A major solar outburst could end an ice age. It would incinerate the surface of the earth. What would you have surviving? Large stone structures. What do we have surviving from that earlier period? Large stone structures. For the most parts, it would melt glaciers, it would release pressure on the crust, it would set off earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic activity. This has been documented even with modern, quote, global warming. You'd have great deluges of biblical proportions because you'd evaporate all this ice and water. It would have to come back down again. So I think this is a scenario that does work to explain potentially the end of the last ice age, and I think there's a lot of evidence there. What was the Sphinx weathered by? Come on. Water, torrential rains. Could that tie in? I think so, because I'm now suggesting that the Sphinx goes back to this earlier period. Göbekli Tepe, remember, why were they intentionally burying it? I think to literally protect it from incineration. What was happening at the end of the last ice age? And something that's interesting, this would come in sort of several waves of, solar outbursts, what's known as a coronal mass ejection. Then the sun would seem to calm down a little bit. 2 weeks later, a month later, So it's sort of spitting at you or sneezing at you, the sun. And the way you would survive this is to grow underground. That would be the best way to go. And this is interesting to me because you can go underground with a solar outburst, and you need so much rock to basically protect you from the radiation, that type of thing. You don't need the rock. It's not like huge particles necessarily falling on you. Everyone follow? It's a different type of thing. It's mainly radiation, that type of thing, that you have to do it. And certain archaeologists have been mystified. Well, these early archaeological sites back at the beginning of the Holocene, that is the very end of the last ice age and right after that, why are they so often associated with caves and underground? There's even a cave associated with Göbekli Tepe. Easter Island, remember these houses? I think they tie in. I think they'd be perfect for protecting you from a solar outburst. Some of these may have been built later, just like in the 1950s and 60s and I guess 70s, the Cold War. What did a lot of people have in their backyards? Fallout shelters, just in case. Well, if you had collective memory that these things could happen, might you still be building them just in case it happens again? Yeah, because your ancestors were all killed off except for a couple. So you better protect yourself. Also on Easter Island, when we were there last time, we were told, not asking, it just came up in conversation that they had legends, or part of their story was that they had to go underground for thousands of years. When they say thousands of years, not staying down all the time, but that surface conditions were very bad. They had to go protect themselves. They'd come up, protect themselves again. So there's some of those guys. Here we have, I just show a couple examples, Mesa Verde. I mentioned yesterday Cappadocia. Do we have huge underground cities? Yes. What's the standard archaeological explanation for this? I don't know. Busy work? No. In this case, this is Kamakali, the underground city, and the standard explanation here is this is to protect yourself from invaders. You go underground, protect yourself, and I don't deny that these were used in Hittite times, or Greco-Roman times, or Byzantine times, but that doesn't mean that's where they originated. Everyone follow? They were using and reusing these. And I've got to say, when you're down there, it's really amazing. I'll be back down there in a couple of weeks. Some of you should come join me and Katie, because we'll go visit it. And this one in particular goes down 8 or more stories, perfect ventilation. It's extremely sophisticated construction, and no one ultimately knows how old. And I don't buy that you're going to protect yourself from your enemies in this, because what are you going to do? You got 10,000 people down there, literally, or more for some of these cities, and your enemies are roving around. They just find your air vents and your entrances, stop them up, and wait for you to die. You see my point? But if you're talking a natural thing like a solar outburst, it would work very, very well. I've actually done some calculations with astrophysicists as to whether this would work to protect from the radiation, that type of thing. Yes, it seems like it would. So this is where I'm coming from. I want to mention Çatalhöyük. We'll go visit that too. It's 2,000 years newer or younger than Göbekli Tepe. I want you to look at. You know what Göbekli Tepe looks like now? This, I believe, shows how civilization was set back. This is an example of what we had during Siddha, or the solar-induced dark age. What we have here are mud brick structures. Do you see that? No monumental architecture, no huge stonework. This is what we find consistently during this period. It's not that this was just the rural bumpkins or whatever. These are modern sandbags. The sandbags, I think, are more sophisticated than part of the structure. No, I shouldn't say that. But to me, this shows civilization was in a decline, and that we had, again, this solar outburst 9700 BC and went into the Dark Age before civilization re-arose, and this was this earlier cycle of civilization. Now, people always ask me when I'm talking about this, so I'm going to address it now before I forget, or before you ask me and I have to say it 5 or 6 or 20 or 50 times separately. Could it happen again? What's the answer? Yes, of course it could. One truism in geology is things that happened in the past, are they going to happen again in the future? Yeah. And, learn from the past. I guess that's a historical thing. Geology is, it happened before, it will happen again. Thomas Gold, who I mentioned before, who was very much interested in this, suggested that it might happen about every 10,000 years. That's probably a pretty good estimate. How long ago was the last one that I'm suggesting? Yeah, well, almost 12,000 years ago. Are we a little overdue? Yeah. Okay, some real data for that. This is the end of the last ice age, basically right here. This is isotope data that I won't get into this heavily, why it correlates with solar activity, but it's beryllium, that type of thing. And it maps solar activity from the 10th millennium, that is end of the last ice age, up to present time. So this is 10,000 BC here, up to 4,000 BC. Everyone see? 4,000 BC here. I'm not very facile with this marker, up to present, 2000 AD. So do you see how solar activity was really high at the end of the last ice age and just after that? Do you see that? This is the red. Plus, not only was it very high, do you see how it was very erratic? Very high, very low, very high, very low. The sun didn't know what it was doing. It couldn't make up its mind. It was schizophrenic. This is what you get when the sun is going through turbulation. Basically, one way to describe it is it's going through disequilibrium and going through a state change. Stars do this periodically. They build up disequilibrium. They have to equilibrate again. The sun was doing that back at the end of the last ice age and just after there. And you see how it slowly calmed down. By 6000 BC, it sort of calmed down, and it's been quite calm, more or less. Just think of it as below this red line, ever since, even really calm, and this is what's known as a little ice age, etc., until very recently. What's happened? It's starting to shoot up. It's starting to show activity. And if you follow the sun like Katie does on a daily basis, seriously, it's showing this incredible activity, this incredible volatility. This is what we had at the end of the last ice age. We've heard about CMEs from several of the speakers before, how they're affecting us, even mentally, physically. This is real. This is happening. Also, can it affect electronics? Yes, yes. So I didn't get into it today. You can read about it in the book, because when you go grab a copy in a few minutes, I'm not joking. Don't laugh. There's something known as the Carrington event in 1859, which from an astrophysical perspective was very small, but from a human perspective, it was a major solar outburst. It wiped out the telegraph lines at the time. This was 1859. It's the biggest one we've seen in modern historical times, that is since the mid-19th century, when we've had a way to map what they call geomagnetic storms, a way to record it. If this happened in the 1500s or even the 1700s, would people even know about other than to see the lights in the sky? Or if you had a big enough one to touch down and cause incineration or vitrification, then you would know about it. But this 1859 Carrington event, if it happened in a few minutes, would be basically all be dead. Why, that might be over extreme, but would all the lights go out? Would all our computers fry? And it not only because of lack of electricity, but you get what they call solar proton events, etc. An EMP, if you know what that is, electromagnetic pulse. It would wipe out communication. It would be a bad scene. There was a small one in May 1921 that, if it occurred today, would cause hundreds of millions of people to have blackouts. Why didn't it happen in 1921? Were we as sophisticated in 1921 electronically? No. And what little was much more robust. It's interesting, in 1859, the telegraph systems were incredibly robust, yet they still got burnt out because it was so large. You may or may not have heard of this, but in 1989, a little solar storm, depending on where it hits on Earth, a big one will hit the entire Earth. A small one, can be more localized, wiped out transmission lines for Hydro-Quebec, caused a blackout for 6 million people. We had more in 2003 that caused blackouts in Sweden and South Africa. We barely missed being hit by a big one in 2012, which if it had hit, we'd still be picking up the pieces today. We wouldn't have this conference at the moment. Another thing that's very scary, and I don't want to be scary, but I want to inform you, because we need to do something about these problems. What is one of the ways that we make power now, which is incredibly dangerous? Nuclear power. If you have a shutdown of the grid system, you know that nuclear power plants start overheating. They have all kinds of problems. They can spew out radiation. Remember Fukushima? Yes, so we have really put ourselves into a bind as a civilization at many levels. We're incredibly vulnerable to something that could happen, and I hate to say it will happen, it's just a matter of when will it happen. Okay, so civilization existed prior to the end of the last ice age, got wiped out, and then reemerged. That's part of my point. The classical ancients, did they speak of even more ancient civilizations? We talked about that. The Yuga cycle, have you heard of the Yuga cycle before? That may tie in here, of cycles of civilization. How far back could we go and talk about earlier cycles of civilization, even before, not our cycle, not before the last cycle in the Younger Dryas, but could there be earlier cycles before that? So I'm going to pull out and end here. We have to put together Easter Island. Wouldn't it be nice to all go to Easter Island? Tib, we should go to Easter Island. It's just a beautiful place. I'll leave it there. Contact us. Go grab a copy of the book.
Round of applause for Robert Schoch, please. So we thank Robert and Katie for their incredible lives, for the body of work they're providing, and it is absolutely making a difference, and we honor you. Thank you.
Christ.